When Gideon Holt, the most powerful man on the frontier, stepped out from among 10 of the most beautiful and educated women in the West to choose a wife, the entire land held its breath in anticipation. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. He disregarded it all, disregarded silk dresses, education, beauty, and laid his hand on a woman the crowd was laughing at. That decision not only shook the frontier, it changed everything forever. Like, comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has come, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next installments. The morning Gideon Holt decided to take a wife, the sky over Harlan County was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and yellow and mean-looking, the kind of sky that made cattle restless and men check their rifles without quite knowing why. He hadn't announced it in advance. That wasn't his way. He'd simply sent word through 3 different riders to 3 different settlements. Come to Coldwater Flats on the 14th. Bring your daughters if they're of age and willing. No explanation beyond that. No promises. Just Gideon Holt's name at the bottom of the message, which was enough. It had always been enough. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline, 47 wagons were parked along the main stretch of Coldwater Flats, their wheels cutting deep into the dried mud of the road. Families had traveled through the night from as far as Redstone Crossing and the Callaway settlements near the river. Some of the wagons were fine, polished wood and brass fittings, horses that cost more than most men earned in a year. Others were patched together with rope and ambition, driven by fathers who figured a Holt connection was worth a hard ride and a sleepless night. The Holt Ranch sat 3 miles east of Coldwater Flats, but Gideon had chosen to conduct his selection in town. Some people thought this was unusual. Those who knew him understood it was intentional. He didn't want women paraded through his home like livestock at a sale. Whatever this was, he seemed determined to treat it with a kind of rough dignity that didn't entirely make sense to anyone watching. 10 women had been quietly identified as the serious candidates before the day even began. This wasn't Gideon's doing. It was the doing of the families themselves, who had spent the previous weeks maneuvering and negotiating among themselves with the kind of political precision usually reserved for land disputes. By the time the wagons rolled into Coldwater Flats, everyone already knew who the 10 were, and everyone had an opinion. Clara Whitmore, 22, from the Whitmore cattle family, educated at a finishing school in St. Louis, reportedly fluent in 2 languages, and beautiful in the unsettling way of a painting that cost more than a house. She wore a pale blue dress that morning that her mother had ordered from a seamstress in Denver, and she moved through the crowd with the careful awareness of someone who had been told her whole life that she was being watched. Beside her stood Josephine Aldridge, whose father owned the Aldridge grain operation and 300 acres of bottomland along the Copper Fork. Josephine was quieter than Clara, with dark eyes and the kind of steady, measuring intelligence that made people slightly uncomfortable. She was the one, most observers agreed, who actually understood numbers. Then there was Nettie Cross, whose family had recently acquired significant timber rights in the Northern Territories. Ruth Callan, whose uncle sat on the Territorial Council. Margaret Bauer, whose late grandfather had left the family a controlling interest in a Coldwater Flats bank. And 5 others, each representing a family with something significant to offer, each dressed carefully and standing straight, aware that this was, in ways they didn't entirely resent, a transaction. Gideon arrived at 10 o'clock on a gray horse he'd owned for 11 years, a horse with a notched ear and a way of looking at things that matched its rider's expression, watchful, unhurried, and not particularly impressed. He was 41 years old. He had a face that had been worked on by weather and years, and if the stories were accurate, at least 2 separate incidents that had come close to killing him. His jaw was crooked from an old break that hadn't healed straight. His left hand was missing the tip of the ring finger, a detail that somehow became more noticeable the longer you looked at him. He was not a handsome man. He was something more durable than handsome. He dismounted at the edge of the crowd, handed his reins to nobody in particular. A young boy darted forward to take them, and walked into the center of the gathering without greeting anyone first. The crowd parted for him the way water parts around a stone that has been sitting in the same river for a long time. The 10 women stood in a loose arrangement in front of the livery stable, which someone had decorated with bunting in what now felt like a grotesque miscalculation. Gideon stopped 12 feet away from them and looked. He looked for a long time, long enough that people in the crowd began to shift their weight and clear their throats. Clara Whitmore smiled at him. It was a practiced smile, warm and calibrated, and under other circumstances it would have been devastatingly effective. Josephine Aldridge met his eyes directly, which took nerve and she knew it. Several of the others dropped their gazes to the ground, which was either modesty or strategy. It was difficult to tell which. Gideon looked at all of them. Then he looked past them. His gaze had settled on someone, about 30 feet to the left of the assembled women, near the water trough at the side of the livery. A young woman stood there who was clearly not part of the formal gathering. She wasn't dressed for it. She was wearing a dark gray work dress, plain and clean but obviously mended at one sleeve, the kind of dress you wore when you expected to do something useful with your day. Her hair was pulled back with a practicality that suggested she hadn't spent much time on it. She wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. Her nose was a little broad, her chin too square, her coloring unremarkable. She was, by the specific standards of that particular morning's particular pageant, exactly nobody. She wasn't watching Gideon, she was watching the ranch, or rather she was watching the idea of the ranch. The information about it that was visible even from Coldwater Flats, if you knew how to read it. The condition of the horses that had arrived in Gideon's party. The way the 3 ranch hands who'd ridden in with him moved, slightly too tired, slightly too careful. The inventory wagon parked at the edge of the gathering that was half empty in ways that suggested the ranch had been purchasing less than it needed. Her eyes were doing something quiet and methodical, taking stock of things that weren't any of her business. Gideon watched her do this for about 45 seconds. Then he walked over. The crowd didn't understand what was happening at first. There was a collective delay, like the pause before thunder after lightning, and then the murmuring began. "Excuse me," Gideon said. The young woman turned. She'd been so absorbed in her assessment of the inventory wagon that she hadn't noticed him approach, and her surprise was completely genuine. Not the performed surprise of the women who'd been standing on display, but the real kind, the kind that made her take a half step back and blink. "I didn't," she started. "I'm sorry, I wasn't in your way, was I?" "No," Gideon said. "What were you looking at?" She hesitated. There was a calculation happening behind her eyes, a rapid weighing of whether honesty was advisable, and then she seemed to decide it was, or perhaps that the alternative was worse. "Your supplies," she said. "The inventory wagon. You're running short on salt and probably on lamp oil, based on the weight distribution. And whoever shod that bay mare on the left did it wrong. She's going to throw that shoe inside of a week." Gideon looked back at the bay mare. Then he looked at the woman. "Who are you?" he said. "Mara Ashcroft," she said. "My father had a homestead about 12 miles east toward the Broken Spur Ridge. He passed in the spring." "What are you doing here?" "Came in with the Hendersons. They had a delivery." She glanced at the crowd, which had begun to notice the conversation and was craning accordingly, and something about her expression suggested she wished she'd stood somewhere less visible. "I can go if I'd like you to stay," Gideon said. He said it simply, without performance, and then turned and walked back toward the assembled crowd and the 10 women in their good dresses and their careful postures. And he said to the families gathered there, in a voice that carried across the entire width of Coldwater Flats, "I've made my choice." There was a silence so complete that someone's horse sneezed, and it sounded like a gunshot. "Her," Gideon said, and pointed back at Mara Ashcroft standing by the water trough in her mended gray dress. What followed was not dignified. The sound that rose from the crowd was not quite laughter at first. It was too confused for that, too uncertain of itself. But it became laughter. It started with a few people who thought they were witnessing a joke, then spread to people who weren't sure but didn't want to be left out. And within 60 seconds, the entire public stretch of Coldwater Flats was ringing with it. Mara stood very still. She had a way of going still that would become, over time, one of the things people noticed about her. But that morning it looked like shock, because it partly was. Her face had done something complicated and then settled into nothing readable, which was its own kind of reaction. Clara Whitmore's expression had gone from gracious to something much less gracious with an efficiency that suggested the graciousness had always been the performance. Her mother, standing behind her, had a grip on the woman's arm that was probably painful, though Clara didn't show it. Raymond Whitmore, Clara's father, pushed through the crowd toward Gideon. He was a large man who had made a lot of money by being the largest, loudest presence in any room, and he employed that strategy now. "What in the hell is this?" he said, not quietly. "Is this your idea of a joke, Holt? Because if it is—" "It's not," Gideon said. "That girl is nobody. Her father was a dirt farmer who couldn't keep 40 acres solvent. She has nothing. Her family has nothing." Whitmore's voice was climbing. "You have a ranch that runs 12,000 head. You have land from here to the Callaway River. You're going to attach yourself to that? To her?" "Yes," Gideon said. "Why?" Whitmore demanded. The crowd had gone quieter now, hungry for the answer, and Whitmore knew it and used it. "Give me one reason. Give me any reason that makes a lick of sense." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He glanced back at Mara, who was still standing by the water trough with her hands at her sides. Then he said, at a volume the whole crowd could hear, "Because every woman you put in front of me spent the last 10 minutes looking at me. She spent them looking at the ranch." He let that sit. "I don't need someone to look at me," he said. "I need someone who can see." Waltz. The ride back to the Holt Ranch was the quietest Mara had experienced since her father's burial. Gideon hadn't said much beyond the practical. There was a wagon for her things. She had a small trunk and a leather satchel, which the driver loaded without comment. The drive took just under an hour. Gideon rode alongside on the gray horse and didn't attempt conversation, which Mara found she was grateful for because she didn't have words available for whatever this was. She'd been in Coldwater Flats that day because Eleanor Henderson had asked her to help load deliveries and had offered a meal and $50 in exchange. That was the whole of it. Mara had not come looking for anything. She had not, in particular, come looking for a husband. She was 24 years old. She had spent the last 4 years managing her father's failing homestead with a pragmatism born of necessity rather than any particular talent. Though she had developed talent along the way people develop skills when the alternative is catastrophe. She could read a balance sheet. She could estimate livestock health by observation. She could identify the 3 most likely reasons a water source might be underperforming and address 2 of them herself. These were not skills that had made her popular in any social sense, and she had stopped expecting them to. She was also, she thought privately and without excessive self-pity, not what most people meant when they said a woman was handsome. She knew this not from cruelty, though there had been some of that, but from the simple evidence of mirrors and the behavior of rooms. People looked past her at other people. It had been this way long enough that she'd mostly stopped noticing, until today, when apparently someone had not looked past her. And now she was in a wagon heading toward the largest cattle operation in Harlan County to marry a man she had spoken to for approximately 3 minutes. He's either brilliant or he's lost his mind, she thought, and I can't tell which from 3 minutes. The Holt Ranch revealed itself gradually as the wagon crested a long rise about 2 miles east of town. Mara had heard descriptions of it, but descriptions turned out to be inadequate. It was large, genuinely large in a way that went beyond her mental adjustment for frontier exaggeration. The main house was 2 stories of solid construction, not beautiful, but built to last, with a wide covered porch that looked like it had been repaired in sections over many years. Behind it spread out buildings in various states of maintenance, a large barn, 2 smaller structures, a bunkhouse, a workshop she couldn't identify at distance. But even from the rise, even with the scale of it, Mara could see what the crowd back in Coldwater Flats couldn't or hadn't bothered to. The fence lines along the near pasture were maintained inconsistently, good in some sections, neglected in others. One of the outbuildings had roof damage that had gone unaddressed for at least a season, judging by the weathering around the patch. The pasture grass in the closest field was grazed down harder than it should have been, suggesting livestock management that was either understaffed or badly organized. The ranch wasn't failing, but it was working harder than it needed to, in the way of a machine with loose gears, expending more effort than the output justified. She was quiet about these observations. There was no reason to announce them. The wagon pulled into the main yard and 3 ranch hands materialized to meet it, or rather, to meet Gideon, who had ridden ahead and was already dismounting. They were wary of Mara in the way of men who had been told something was happening and hadn't decided how to feel about it yet. One of them, a broad-shouldered man of about 50 with a white scar running from his left ear to his jaw, looked at her with open skepticism, not hostile exactly, but not neutral. "This is Mara Ashcroft," Gideon said to the yard generally. "We'll be married Thursday." The three hands looked at each other with the synchronized control of men who had learned when not to speak in front of their employer. The one with the scar gave a short nod. The other two followed his lead. That night, Mara was given a room on the second floor of the main house that had clearly been unoccupied for a long time. There were no personal touches, no evidence of habitation, just furniture and a window that looked east toward the darker shapes of the far pasture. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the evening, voices from the bunkhouse, the distant movement of cattle, a horse that needed to be told twice to settle. She thought about leaving. The thought was serious. She could be back in Coldwater Flats by morning on foot, and from there she could find the Hendersons or someone else heading toward the Laramie settlements, where her father had a distant cousin who'd offered, vaguely, to have her come. It would not be a good life exactly, but it would be a predictable one, which had its own value. She thought about the ranch instead, its inventory gaps, its overworked pasture, its inconsistent fences. She thought about the way the hay yield had clearly been below expected based on the storage levels she'd glimpsed through the barn door. She thought about the three ranch hands and the particular kind of tiredness in them that wasn't physical, or not only physical. She pulled the satchel onto her lap and took out the small ledger she always carried. It was a habit from managing her father's accounts. She processed things better in writing. She opened it to a fresh page and began to make notes, not because anyone had asked her to, but because her mind was that kind of mind, and there was no point fighting it. She wrote until the lamp oil ran low, then stopped and lay down in her clothes and stared at the dark ceiling until sleep arrived. The wedding was small and dry, conducted by a justice of the peace named Elias Croft, who drove out from Coldwater Flats on Thursday morning and performed the ceremony with the professional neutrality of a man who had learned not to have opinions about what people in front of him were doing. There were no guests, by Gideon's explicit choice. Two ranch hands served as witnesses, signed the paper, and went back to work. Mara wore the best dress she owned, which was a deep brown wool that was several years old and fit well because she'd altered it herself twice. She had pinned her hair up in a way that took time and looked it, and Gideon had put on a clean shirt. They stood in front of Elias Croft in the main room of the house and said the words required of them. When it was done, Gideon shook Croft's hand, saw him back to his wagon, and returned to find Mara standing in the center of the main room with her hands folded. "I have questions," she said. He looked at her. "All right. The south pasture. How long has it been grazed that hard?" He paused, visibly recalibrating the direction he'd expected the conversation to go. "2 seasons, maybe a little more. And you haven't rotated because I don't have the hands to manage 2 separate grazing zones simultaneously, and the north pasture has a fence problem I haven't had the resources to fix." "What else?" she asked. "What do you mean, what else? What other problems? Besides the pasture and the north fence and the supply gaps and the roof on the third outbuilding?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down in the chair at the end of the room and looked at her with something that was difficult to read. Not unfriendly, but watchful. "Water source on the eastern range has been unpredictable for 2 seasons, he said. "Might be a blockage upstream, might be something shifting in the ground. I haven't had time to investigate properly, and I lost my bookkeeper in March. He left for the mining territories. I've been managing the accounts myself, and I'm not good at it." Mara nodded slowly, working through the information. "You're bleeding out slowly," she said. "Nothing fatal yet, but you're losing efficiency at about 4 different points simultaneously, and they're all compounding each other." "I know," he said. "Why didn't you hire another bookkeeper?" "I tried. Nobody I'd trust came available." He paused. "And then I thought maybe the solution wasn't another bookkeeper." She looked at him. "What was the solution?" "Someone who could see more than the books," he said. "Someone who could see all of it." There it was again. The thing he'd said in Coldwater Flats. Someone who can see. It landed differently this time, with specificity behind it. He hadn't been talking about her in the abstract. He'd been talking about her actual mind, the way it worked, what it did with information. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Show me the account books." He showed her the account books. "I must Detroit." She spent 3 days with the books before she spoke about them. During those 3 days, she also walked the full perimeter of the south pasture, measured the north fence problem by eye, spent an afternoon at the eastern water source digging carefully around the upstream area until she found the partial beaver dam that was interrupting the flow, and had one conversation with each of the 4 full-time ranch hands. The conversations were difficult, in the sense of pulling a tooth that doesn't want to come. The hands were polite in the minimal way required and closed in every other way. The man with the scar, whose name turned out to be Walt Greer and who had been with Gideon for 11 years, was the most honest, which meant he was honest enough to be dismissive. "You want to ask something? Ask it," he said on the second day, when she'd been watching the cattle rotation and hadn't spoken for 10 minutes. "When did the east herd last get moved to the creek pasture?" she asked. He told her. "That's too long," she said. "I know," he said, in a tone that made clear he didn't particularly need to know it from her. "The grass is going to go down another 20% by next month if it stays where it is," she said. "You'll lose the grazing benefit for the whole season." "I'm aware of how cattle work," Walt said. "I know you are," Mara said, without sharpness. "I'm telling you what I'm going to recommend to Gideon, so you're not surprised when it happens." Walt looked at her for a moment. "You already decided?" "Yes," she said. He didn't respond to that immediately. He turned back to the fence he'd been checking and continued down the line. Mara walked alongside him in silence, which seemed to be acceptable, or at least not unacceptable. On the evening of the 3rd day, she laid the account books and her own notes on the table in the main room and went through them with Gideon for 2 hours. She showed him where the money was going that didn't need to go there. She showed him where underinvestment in one area was creating triple the cost elsewhere. She showed him the grazing rotation schedule she'd worked out, which would require fixing the north fence first, a 2-day job if done with 3 hands, before it could be implemented, but which would recover the south pasture within 1 season. "The water source is already fixed," she said. "The beaver dam. I cleared it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "By yourself?" "Yes." You didn't need to do that yourself. I could have sent someone." "You could have," she agreed. "But I was there, and it was a manageable problem, so I addressed it." He looked at her across the table. "Mara." It was the first time he'd used her name directly. She'd noticed. "Yes," she said. "Why are you doing all of this?" She thought about the question. It was a genuine one, not a test, and it deserved a genuine answer. "Because it's in front of me," she said finally. "And because I can see how to fix it. And I don't—" She paused, choosing the words carefully. "I don't know how to look at something broken and not try to understand why it's broken." He nodded slowly. "Is that true about people too?" She thought about that. "Sometimes," she said, "when they let me." He poured 2 glasses of water from the pitcher on the table and pushed one toward her, and they continued going through the notes until past midnight. The first indication of the trouble that was coming arrived 11 days after the wedding in the form of a canceled supply order. Mara was the one who discovered it. She'd been cross-referencing the ranch's ongoing contracts with the account books when she found the cancellation notice, a formal letter from Aldridge Grain, the operation owned by Josephine Aldridge's father, informing the Holt Ranch that its account had been closed effective immediately and that future orders would not be accepted. She set the letter on the table and found a second one beneath it, from a different supplier. Then a third. 3 supply contracts, all canceled within the same week. She sat with this information for a while before she went to find Gideon. He was in the barn working on something mechanical with the focused displeasure of a man who would rather be doing almost anything else. She handed him the letters without commentary and waited while he read. His face didn't change much. It tightened around the eyes in a way she was beginning to recognize as what happened when something confirmed a suspicion he'd already had. "When did these come in?" he said. "Last week, I think. They were filed in the wrong stack." She paused. Who would do this? Take your pick, he said. Whitmore? Whitmore has the loudest reason, but Whitmore doesn't act alone. He's the kind of man who builds a coalition before he does anything, so he's protected if it goes wrong. Gideon set the letters on the workbench. The families I didn't choose from are not used to being ignored. So they're going to try to starve you out. Going to try, he said. What do we do? He looked at her. The question had landed differently than he expected, she thought. He'd been bracing for recrimination or fear, and she'd given him neither, and he was recalibrating. There's a mill in Redstone Crossing that's not affiliated with any of them, he said, and a feed operation run by a man named Jonas Webb down toward the Sutton Valley. They'll cost more to deal with because of the distance. How much more? He told her. She ran the numbers in her head. We can absorb it for 2 months, she said. After that, if the grazing rotation starts producing the way it should, we reduce the feed dependency anyway. It's tight, but it works. She looked at him. We have to fix the north fence this week. I'll put 3 men on it tomorrow, he said. Walt Greer, who had been quietly present on the far side of the barn through this entire exchange, made no sound. But later, 2 days later, while the fence repair crew was working, Mara brought them water, and Walt accepted the cup from her without his usual precision of minimal acknowledgement. It was a small thing. She didn't remark on it. The rumors started the following week, and they were creative. The cleanest version was that Gideon Holt had suffered some kind of breakdown and married a woman from sheer insanity. The versions with more imagination suggested Mara had used some form of manipulation to engineer the situation, which was both flattering and insulting in a ratio she couldn't quite calculate. One version, which made it back to her via the wife of a ranch hand who'd heard it in town, held that Mara had been carrying on with Gideon for months before the selection and had simply forced the outcome through threats. She heard all of this and did nothing about it because there was nothing practical to do, and because addressing rumors required energy she was allocating elsewhere. What she did notice was the way the stories traveled. They spread too efficiently, too consistently, with too many people repeating the same specific details across too wide a geography for this to be organic gossip. Someone was coordinating it. Someone wanted the story told in a particular way. She made a note of this in her ledger. She also noted one afternoon that the 2 youngest ranch hands, a 17-year-old named Cal Briggs and a lanky boy of about 19 called Ned, who had been with the operation for less than a year, were the ones who seemed to actually look at her when she spoke. Not with deference, but with attention, which was something different. They watched her the way she watched inventory wagons, assessing, not committing. She found small opportunities to be useful near them. She helped Cal repair a poorly set fence post one morning, working efficiently alongside him without making a production of it, and he watched her technique and then adopted it without comment, which felt like a conversation. She showed Ned a better way to assess water quality at the creek by checking for particular signs in the silt, and he wrote it down in a small notebook, which she hadn't expected and which meant something she couldn't quite name. They were the first cracks in the wall. Gideon came home from Coldwater Flats on a Thursday in the 3rd week of their marriage with a bad mood and worse news. He dropped into the chair at the kitchen table and rubbed his face with both hands. Rancher meeting last night, he said. Mara was at the stove. She didn't turn around. And? Hartley Voss is calling in a loan, old agreement from 3 years back that I'd forgotten about. He's got the paper. He paused. It's a $500 note due in 60 days. Can you cover it? Not comfortably, not with the supply costs running higher because of the distance to Redstone. She turned the burner down and turned around. Is Voss in the coalition? Voss married into the Callan family, Gideon said. So, yes. She picked up her ledger from the side table and opened it. What did the spring cattle sale bring in? He told her. She ran figures. If we move the secondary herd sale up by 3 weeks, we can cover the note with about $60 to spare, she said. It means getting them to market before they're quite where you'd want them, but we'd lose less than if Voss finds grounds to escalate. Moving the sale up means negotiating with buyers who weren't expecting to buy yet. Who do you use? He named a buyer in Laramie, a man named Doyle, who'd worked with the Holt operation for 7 years. Write him tonight, she said. Tell him you have an early offering at a slight discount. Men like Doyle don't refuse a slight discount. She turned back to the stove. Also write to the county land office and request a formal copy of the Voss loan agreement. Make sure the terms match what Voss says they are. There was a pause. You think he'd falsify the terms? I think I'd want to know for certain that he didn't, she said. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then she heard the scrape of the chair as he got up and went to find paper. The letter to Doyle went out the next morning. The request to the county land office went out the same day. The Voss note, it turned out, when the official copy arrived 2 weeks later, had an accuracy problem. A small one. A discrepancy in the interest calculation that amounted to a technical deficiency in the enforcement clause. The family's solicitor, a careful man in Coldwater Flats named Harper, confirmed it. Voss couldn't call the note under the original terms. He could renegotiate but not demand. The secondary herd sale happened as scheduled. Doyle took the offering at the slight discount without negotiation, which told Mara something about how tight the Laramie supply had been running. She recorded all of it in the ledger, then closed it and put it away. That evening, sitting on the front porch in the cooling air after dinner, Gideon said, "You know they're not done." "I know," she said. "This was just testing, seeing how we'd respond." "Yes. It's going to get worse before it stops." She looked out at the yard, at the line of the barn against the last light, at the shape of the repaired north fence visible at the edge of the far pasture. "I know," she said again, "but the fence is fixed, and the pasture rotation starts next week, and the water source is running clean." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm more worried about what we don't know yet than what we do." Gideon turned to look at her. In the 7 years he'd lived alone in this house before she arrived, he had not been in the habit of sitting on the porch in the evening. He'd been in the habit of working until there was no light and then sleeping. He wasn't entirely sure when this had become the end of the day, but it had. "What do you think we don't know yet?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "That's what worries me." They sat with the frontier dark coming down around the ranch, and the cattle settled in the field, and somewhere south of them a coyote said something short and unanswered to the rising moon. The first real test of the grazing rotation came in the 4th week, and it almost failed because of a man named Dale Pruitt. Pruitt was the senior hand after Walt, 44 years old, with 15 years of cattle work behind him and a talent for making younger men feel stupid without ever saying anything directly insulting. He'd been with the Holt operation for 3 years, which was long enough to develop strong opinions about how things should be done, and short enough that those opinions hadn't yet been tempered by Gideon's occasional corrections. He was not, in the technical sense, a bad worker. He was the kind of worker who performed well when left alone, and became a problem the moment someone tried to change the conditions around him. Mara had been aware of him the way you're aware of a loose board on a staircase. She'd felt the give, noted it, and planned her steps accordingly. What she hadn't planned for was the morning she came out to the south pasture to find he'd moved the rotation boundary back 20 yards from where she'd set it, essentially restoring the overgrazing pattern she'd been working to correct for 2 weeks. She stood at the fence line for a moment, looking at the stakes. Then she went to find Pruitt. He was at the water trough near the barn, filling something, and he straightened when he saw her coming with the particular ease of a man who had already decided on his position. "The south stakes," she said. "They were set wrong," he said. "Cattle couldn't reach the creek at that distance." "They could, I measured it." "With respect, ma'am, measuring and knowing how cattle actually move across ground aren't the same thing." She looked at him. The man was technically polite and functionally dismissive, which she thought was probably intentional and certainly practiced. "How long have you been rotating livestock on overworked pasture?" she asked. "Long enough." "Then you know that what I set will recover that field inside of 2 months," she said. "What you moved it back to will extend the damage into next year." "What I moved it back to," Pruitt said, with the calm of a man who was very confident about where the power sat, "is where it's been for 3 years. Before you arrived." She was quiet for a second. It would have been easy to escalate. She had the authority, technically, and the argument, but she'd learned early in her father's failed operation that winning a direct confrontation with a resistant worker usually produced technical compliance and active sabotage, which was worse than the original problem. Talk to Walt, she said. Ask him what the Southfield yield looked like last season compared to 3 years ago. Ask him to give you the actual numbers. She paused. Then move the stakes back where I set them. She left before he could respond. Walt gave Pruitt the numbers that afternoon, apparently without commentary, just the numbers. The following morning, the stakes were back where Mara had set them. Pruitt didn't speak to her about it, and she didn't raise it again. But she noted that Cal Briggs had watched the whole sequence from 30 feet away and had returned to his work with an expression that was carefully neutral and internally decided. These were the kinds of battles that didn't look like battles from outside. They didn't produce dramatic confrontations or visible victories. They were grinding and repetitive, and sometimes you won and sometimes you simply moved the stakes again, and the cost was a kind of sustained attention that didn't leave much room for anything else. Mara had grown up with that kind of work. It was the only kind she trusted, actually, but it was exhausting in ways that crept up slowly and announced themselves at inconvenient times. One night, well past midnight, Gideon came downstairs to find her at the table with the ledger open and a cold cup of coffee sitting forgotten beside it. He didn't say anything at first, just filled the coffee cup from the pot and set it back in front of her. She looked up. I can't figure out where the cattle loss numbers went wrong, she said without preamble. The figures for March and April are inconsistent in a way that doesn't match natural loss rates. Something in here doesn't account. He sat down across from her. What does it look like? Like either the count was done wrong, or... She stopped. Or someone adjusted it, he said. I don't want to accuse anyone without being certain. Who had access to the books in March? Besides you? Your previous bookkeeper, Simmons? He left in March. Could be before he left. Gideon was quiet, working through it. Could also be someone outside who had access to the books through him. She wrote a note in the margin and closed the ledger. I need the original tally sheets from the spring count. Do you still have them? Somewhere. I'll find them. He did find them, 2 days later, in a wooden box in the workshop. The tally sheets and the ledger didn't match in ways that were too consistent to be accidental. 43 head of cattle, accounted for in the original count, had disappeared from the books in March with no recorded sale, no recorded loss, and no recorded movement. At the market price for that grade of animal at that time of year, the number came to roughly $800. Simmons, Gideon said when she showed him. Or Simmons and someone else, she said. The kind of coordination this represents. Cutting your supply lines, calling in the Voss note. It feels like someone was running multiple threads at the same time. She set down the tally sheets. Someone was trying to create a crisis before you could stabilize. And then I went and chose a wife who can read a balance sheet, Gideon said. She looked at him. He said it flatly, without humor but without bitterness, and she understood that it wasn't a complaint. It was an accounting of the situation. They didn't expect that, she said. No, he said. They expected someone who would be busy worrying about whether she was welcome. She thought about the gray dress and the water trough and the 47 wagons and the laughter. She thought about what that morning had looked like from the outside, how completely, comfortably wrong everyone had been in their certainty about what was happening. I'm not particularly easy to distract, she said. I noticed that, Gideon said, in Coldwater Flats, before I said a word to you. The coalition's next move came from a direction she hadn't anticipated, which annoyed her and motivated her in equal measure. A woman named Frances Aldridge, Josephine's mother, and a person with social authority in Harlan County that operated entirely through the mechanisms of invitation and exclusion, began organizing what she described to anyone who would listen as a moral concern about the Holt household. The specific content of the concern shifted depending on the audience, but its practical effect was consistent. The wives of 3 neighboring ranchers stopped speaking to Mara when their paths crossed in Coldwater Flats, and the woman who ran the dry goods store began taking longer than usual to process her orders. Mara had expected social pressure. She hadn't quite expected the specific texture of it, the way it worked not through confrontation but through the gradual withdrawal of ordinary courtesy, like warmth being removed from a room by inches until you only noticed the cold when it was already everywhere. She came back from a supply run in early October with a specific hardness behind her eyes that she'd been working to keep out of her face. Gideon's youngest hand, Cal Briggs, was in the yard when she pulled in, and he looked at her face and then looked quickly away, which told her the effort hadn't entirely succeeded. She unhitched the supply wagon herself, which she didn't strictly need to do, but the physical work gave her somewhere to put the feeling. Cal appeared beside her after a minute and took the other side without being asked. "Mrs. Holt?" he said, and stopped. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He was 17 and he was figuring out what to do with his face when he had something to say that he wasn't sure would land. Ned and me were talking about the rotation, about how the South pasture grass is coming back." She glanced at him. "It's coming back a little faster than I expected," she said. "The root system was in better shape than the surface showed." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment, working a buckle loose. "We were thinking, if you needed help going through the rest of those tally sheets, the older ones, we could. We can both read well enough. It'd go faster with more eyes." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him squarely. He met her eyes, which took something. He was 17 and she was the woman the whole county was making jokes about, and he was offering to help her anyway. "All right," she said, "after supper." The three of them spent 4 evenings going through 5 years of tally sheets, Cal and Ned working through the older records while Mara tracked the pattern of discrepancies across time. What emerged was not a single act of theft, but a slow, long-running bleed that had been happening since before Simmons left, possibly as long as 2 years before. Someone with access to the records had been shaving numbers consistently, not dramatically, in a way that would have looked like ordinary variance to anyone who wasn't looking specifically for a pattern. "That's not Simmons," Gideon said when she showed him. "Simmons wasn't with us 2 years ago." "Who was before Simmons?" He named a man. She wrote it down. They both knew they weren't going to confront the man directly without more than ledger discrepancies. They'd need something harder, something with legal weight. She put it in the column of problems that were real but not yet actionable, and turned her attention back to what was. It was Ned who told her about the water. He came to find her one November morning with a look that had too much in it for his age, the careful expression of someone delivering information they aren't sure will be believed. "The east branch of the creek," he said, "above the property line." She followed him out there. The flow had dropped significantly from what it had been in October. Not a dramatic cut, but enough. She walked the line upstream to the property boundary and stopped. Someone had built a diversion on the neighboring land, not an elaborate structure. A few logs and packed earth, the kind of thing that could be assembled in an afternoon and called accidental if challenged. But it was pulling maybe 15% of the creek volume off toward the Voss property line, and at that rate, by the time spring came and the grazing intensified, the East pasture water supply would be running at a level that would force Gideon to choose between buying water rights or reducing herd size. She stood at the diversion for a long time without speaking. Ned waited. "Don't say anything to the other hands yet," she said finally. "What are you going to do?" "Document it first," she said. "Then do what needs doing." She went back to the house and got her ledger and returned and wrote down everything she could measure. The dimensions of the structure, the estimated reduction in flow, the date, the location relative to the property boundary. She walked the boundary line in both directions and measured where the Voss parcel began. The diversion was 14 yards inside the Voss land, which made it legal, technically. A man had the right to redirect water on his own property. What made it not legal was the water rights agreement that had been filed with the county land office in 1871, which predated Voss's acquisition of that parcel by 3 years and included specific language about downstream maintenance of flow levels. She knew about the 1871 agreement because she'd read every document in the file box in Gideon's workshop, including ones that were so old the ink had gone brown. She sent a letter to the county land office the next morning with the measurements and the relevant agreement terms, filed as a formal complaint. She had Harper, the solicitor in Coldwater Flats, review it first, which cost money they were managing carefully, but he confirmed the language was solid. Gideon read the letter before she sent it. "They'll be furious," he said. "Yes," she said. "Voss has friends in the land office." "I know. That's why I made sure the complaint is clean enough that not acting on it would itself be a violation of the office's charter." She folded the letter. "Voss can be furious. He can't legally ignore a properly filed complaint with that documentation." Gideon looked at her for a moment. Where did you learn the land office charter? In the file box, she said. The 1878 operational guidelines. Someone put them in there with the property documents. I think it might have been you. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in a kind of reluctant recognition. My father put those there, he said. I never read them. She sent the letter. The land office responded in 3 weeks, which was faster than Harper had expected. The response required Voss to restore the creek flow within 30 days or face a formal penalty proceeding. Voss complied. She could tell by the change in the water volume at the east pasture, a small but measurable improvement over the following week. Walt Greer noticed it. He didn't say anything to Mara directly, but she saw him standing at the creek one morning watching the water run, and something in his posture was different from the careful, controlled neutrality he'd maintained since she arrived. He stood there for a while, then walked back toward the barn, and when he passed her in the yard, he gave her a short nod that was not the minimal acknowledgement of a man tolerating a situation. It was something closer to recognition. She nodded back and didn't make more of it than it was. But that evening, when supper was laid out and the hands ate in the bunkhouse as usual, Walt Greer appeared at the back door and said, without particular ceremony, that he'd noticed the gate hinges on the far barn door had gone bad, and he'd fixed them, and that if she had other things like that she wanted handled without pulling men off scheduled work, she could tell him directly. She thanked him. He went back to the bunkhouse. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. The south pasture was recovering. The books were in order. The water was running. The north fence held. The coalition was regrouping. She could feel it, a particular stillness in the way the opposition had gone quiet in November, that felt less like retreat and more like the patience of people who had committed to a longer strategy and were now waiting for the right moment. She didn't know what form it would take. She'd filed away everything she did know, the tally discrepancies, the diversion, the canceled contracts, the Voss note, in a locked box that sat under the desk in the study. One night in late November, after Gideon had gone upstairs and the house was quiet, she sat at the table and looked at what the ranch had been 4 weeks ago and what it was now. The numbers were better. Not good. There were still thin patches in the accounts and a spring that would come with hard decisions about herd size, but better. Measurably, documentably better. She thought about the laughter in Coldwater Flats. She thought about the mended dress and the water trough. She thought about Dale Pruitt and the move stakes and Francis Aldridge and the dry goods store and the long cold work of making the ranch what it needed to be while everyone around her waited for her to quit. She closed the ledger and put it away. She was not going to quit. She'd known this since the first night she'd sat in the unfamiliar room on the second floor and looked east at the dark shape of the far pasture. She'd known it the way you know things that aren't decisions exactly, more like discoveries of what was already true. The fire, when it came, she did not know about yet. But the woman who would face it was already, quietly, fully formed. December came in cold and mean, the kind of cold that settled into the ground and stayed there. And with it came the particular silence that Mara had learned to read as the coalition's patience wearing thin. She felt it in the way information stopped moving. Through October and into November, she'd been able to track the opposition's movements through the ordinary channels of a small frontier community. The dry goods store, the solicitor's waiting room, the rhythms of who was seen talking to whom in Coldwater Flats on supply days. People talked. People always talked. And if you listened carefully without seeming to listen at all, the outline of a plan became visible in the gaps of what wasn't being said. In December, the gaps stopped. The chatter in town went neutral in a way that felt deliberate, and 3 separate people who had, in previous weeks, let something useful slip in Mara's presence now found reasons to be elsewhere when she came in. Someone had told them to be careful. That meant something was close enough that carelessness mattered. She mentioned it to Gideon on a Tuesday evening quietly while they were going over the week's accounts. "They've gone quiet," she said. He looked up from the figures. He'd learned, over the months of their marriage, to take that particular tone in her voice seriously, not because she performed alarm, but because she almost never registered concern she hadn't already evaluated. "How quiet?" "The kind that means they've stopped planning and started moving." She closed the ledger. "We should post a night watch on the herd." "That's a serious step," he said. Not a disagreement, a check. He did this, she'd noticed, when he wanted to make sure she'd thought through the implications, which she generally had, but she'd come to appreciate the habit because it forced her to say the thinking out loud. I know, she said. But if I'm wrong, we lose some sleep. If I'm right and we don't do it, we lose something we can't recover. He sent word to Walt that night. Walt organized the rotation without being asked to explain it to anyone, which was its own form of communication. The hands understood that something had shifted, and their understanding settled over the ranch like a weather change. For 8 days, nothing happened. The watches were quiet. The herd was undisturbed. The cold deepened and the sky stayed clear, and Mara began to wonder, privately, whether she'd miscalibrated. Doubt was a thing she tried to use productively. It sharpened examination, forced rechecking. But at 2 a.m. on the 8th night, standing at the window of the second floor looking out at the yard because she couldn't sleep, the doubt felt less productive and more like simple exhaustion. Then, on the 9th night, Gideon rode out to check on the East Range watch himself. She was asleep when he left. She didn't know he'd gone until Cal Briggs pounded on the back door of the main house at something past midnight, and when she opened it, the boy's face told her everything before he said a word. Mr. Holt got thrown, Cal said. East Range. His horse spooked at something. We don't know what yet. He came down hard. She was already pulling on her coat. How hard? His shoulder, maybe his ribs. He's awake. He's talking, but he can't ride. She went with Cal at a run across the frozen yard, and the cold hit her face like a thrown handful of gravel, and she thought, with the part of her mind that never fully turned off even in crisis, that the timing was not accidental. Gideon was sitting against the base of the eastern fence with Walt crouching beside him and Ned standing a few feet back holding 2 horses. He was conscious and he was angry, which she took as good signs. His left arm was held at an angle that was wrong enough to be visible even in the lantern light, and his breathing had the careful shallowness of a man managing pain by not moving his chest more than necessary. I'm all right, he said before she reached him. You're not all right, she said. Don't do that. He looked at her. Shoulders out. Couple of ribs, maybe. Can you stand? With help. Walt and Cal got him up, and he made no sound during the process, which cost him something visible. They got him onto a horse with the kind of coordinated physical effort that required everyone involved to pretend they weren't witnessing something difficult, and the ride back to the main house was slow and silent. She reset the shoulder herself because the nearest doctor was 12 miles away. And Gideon refused to wait until morning, and because she had done it once before for her father, and remembered the mechanics of it, if not the confidence. It was ugly, and it hurt him badly, and when it was done, he sat breathing in a controlled way for about 30 seconds before he trusted himself to speak. Good, he said finally. It came out compressed. Don't thank me yet, she said. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she put behind her back. You're going to be useless for at least 2 weeks. I'm aware. She wrapped his ribs and got him into a chair in the main room because getting him up the stairs was a problem for tomorrow, and then she went back outside. Walt was in the yard. He hadn't gone to the bunkhouse. The horse, she said. What spooked it? Walt's face was doing the contained thing it did when he was certain about something he wished he wasn't. We found a noise trap, he said, set in the grass on the East Range path, tin cans, wire. Whoever set it knew where Gideon rides that route. She stood in the cold for a moment, working through what that meant. A noise trap was not sophisticated. It was the work of someone who understood horses and who had either watched the ranch long enough to know Gideon's patterns or had been told them by someone who had. Either way, someone had wanted Gideon on the ground. They wanted to take him out of the equation, she said. Walt looked at her steadily. Seems that way. Which means they're moving soon, tonight or tomorrow. I got the same feeling, he said. She sent Cal for Ned and put them both on the south herd, the larger group, the one that represented most of the ranch's remaining value, with instructions to stay visible and make noise and not be predictable about where they stood. She and Walt took the north boundary. She brought her father's rifle, which she was a reasonable shot with at close range and honest about at distance. The attack, when it came from 3 directions at once. It started with fire. The first one caught in the dry grass along the western border at what she estimated was around 2 in the morning, a line of flame that appeared too quickly and too evenly to be accidental, moving with the wind toward the southwest corner of the main pasture. She saw the orange edge of it from the north boundary and shouted for Walt before she'd fully processed what she was looking at. The second fire came up almost simultaneously on the eastern side, set in the dry scrub that bordered the creek bed. She understood the geometry of it in a single terrible second. The two fires were designed to work together, to create a funnel effect with the wind between them, driving both smoke and heat toward the pasture where the herd was grazing. And then she heard the herd. The sound of cattle stampeding is not like anything else. It's too large for the ear to process as individual animals. It becomes something structural, a pressure in the ground as much as a noise in the air, and the particular register of it at full panic is something that sits at the base of the spine and stays there. The south herd had broken before the fire even reached them, which meant there had been a third element. Riders, she guessed, or another noise trap, something that hit the herd from the north and drove them south toward the canyon edge that sat at the bottom of the Holt property's southern boundary. Granite Canyon. 40 feet down and no way back up. 500 head of cattle at a full stampede heading straight for it. She ran. Walt was already running parallel to her, and she could hear him shouting for Cal and Ned, but the wind was wrong, and she didn't know if the boys heard. The western fire was behind her, and the heat of it was pushing forward, and the smoke was moving fast enough that the air tasted of it within 60 seconds. She got to the south pasture edge and saw the herd, a dark mass in motion, the leading edge of them already past the midpoint of the field, moving with the unified terrible momentum of animals that had lost their individual judgment to fear. The canyon was maybe 300 yards south of the pasture boundary. At that speed, they had minutes. She thought about the bridge. There was a wooden bridge at the southwest corner of the property, built 20 years ago across a dry gulch, now only used occasionally for equipment movement. It was old and it was dry, and it was built of materials that, in the current state of the two fires on either side of the property, would catch without much encouragement. But the gulch it crossed ran perpendicular to the canyon, and if the bridge was down, if the crossing was blocked, the leading cattle would be forced to turn east along the gulch edge, away from the canyon's drop. It was not a clean plan. It relied on the herd's behavior under conditions she couldn't fully predict, and if the turn didn't hold, if the momentum carried them past the gulch edge toward the canyon anyway, then the bridge had come down for nothing, and she'd have been better using the time to try to flank the herd. She knew this. She ran toward the bridge anyway. Walt caught up to her at the fence line. "Where are you going?" "Bridge," she said, and she was breathing hard. "If I drop it, they have to turn." He processed this in about 2 seconds. "The fire on the east side. If it reaches the gulch brush, I know." The eastern fire's path would hit the gulch vegetation in maybe 15 minutes. If she was in the gulch when that happened, the escape routes narrowed very fast. "I need something to light it with, and I need it to be fast." Walt reached into his coat without breaking stride and produced a box of matches and a short piece of oil-soaked rag that he carried as a matter of plain habit, which was the most useful habit she had ever witnessed in another human being. She took them without stopping. "Get to Cal and Ned," she said. "Get them to the east side of the herd. Try to flank. Even if it doesn't work fully, it might slow the outside edge." He peeled away, and she kept running. The bridge was 200 yards of dark field and one fence crossing, and she did it in the kind of time her body found when her body understood that there was no other option. The herd noise was enormous behind her and to her right, and the western fire's glow was bright enough now to cast moving orange shadows across the grass. She reached the bridge and looked at it. It was older than she'd estimated from memory. The main timbers were gray and dry, and the decking had gaps where boards had rotted out and never been replaced. Under other circumstances, this would be a maintenance note in her ledger. Tonight, it meant it would go fast. She tied the rag around the base of the nearest support beam and lit it with 3 matches. The first 2 died in the wind, the third caught, and stepped back. The rag caught the beam in under a minute. The beam caught the decking. The decking, in the dry cold of December with the wind pushing from the west, went up with a sound like an exhale. She watched just long enough to know it was committed, and then she ran east along the gulch edge to get clear of the fire's path. and the bridge behind her came down with a sound she felt in her feet before she heard it. The leading cattle hit the collapsed crossing at a diagonal. She heard the sound change, the particular chaos of a stampede hitting an obstacle, the way the momentum fractured and redirected, and she pressed herself against the gulch bank and watched the dark mass of them turn. Not all at once. Not cleanly. The outside edges kept pushing, and there were animals that went too close to the gulch bank, and she couldn't see what happened to them in the dark and the smoke. But the bulk of the herd turned east, the way water turns when a channel closes, and the canyon to the south stayed unmet. She stood in the gulch for a moment, breathing. Then she became aware of the fire. The eastern blaze had moved faster than she'd accounted for, partly because the wind had shifted in the last 5 minutes. Not dramatically, not enough to see if you were running and not watching the smoke, but enough that the brush along the gulch's eastern stretch was now involved, and involved meant burning, and burning meant the gulch was no longer a safe corridor. She looked west. The bridge remains were still going. She looked east. The brush fire was maybe 150 feet down the gulch and moving toward her at a pace that required immediate decision. She went north, up the gulch bank, which was steep and loose-soiled, and she slid back twice before she found purchase, her hands in the dirt, her knee hitting rock hard enough to make something in her vision white out momentarily. She got to the top of the bank and onto flat ground, and the air was thick with smoke, and she couldn't immediately see the main yard or the barn or anything familiar. She moved north by feel and by the diminishing heat of the eastern fire at her back, and the smoke pressed down and she kept low and kept moving, and somewhere ahead of her she could hear Walt's voice shouting something she couldn't parse, and she moved toward the voice the way you move toward the only fixed point in a spinning room. The smoke thinned enough to see at about 50 yards. Walt was at the north pasture fence with Cal beside him, and Cal saw her first and said something to Walt that made him turn, and Walt covered the distance between them with the speed of a man 20 years younger than his body usually admitted to. He didn't say anything. He grabbed her arm above the elbow to steady her, looked at her face, looked at the smoke behind her, and then turned and called to Ned, who materialized from the darkness with 3 horses and the specific expression of someone who had been running on fear for the last 20 minutes and was now trying to figure out if the fear was over. "Heard?" she said. "Turned," Walt said. "Cal held the east flank. It wasn't a good turn. We lost some to the gulch." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, without dressing it. "But the canyon's clear." She nodded. Her knee was bleeding through her pants where she'd hit the rock, and she hadn't noticed until the immediate motion stopped. "The fires? West one is going to burn itself out along the creek bed. East one," he looked behind her, "it needs watching, but the wind is coming back around." She sat down on the ground, which was not a graceful decision, but was the decision her legs made. Cal crouched beside her without being asked, and looked at her knee with the pragmatic focus of a boy who had decided, somewhere in the last several hours, that this was what he did now. He helped. "You dropped the bridge," Ned said. He wasn't accusing her. He was saying it with the tone of someone working out that something they'd witnessed was real. "Yes," she said. "From inside the gulch?" "I went east along the bank." Ned looked at the smoke rising from the gulch's eastern stretch and was quiet for a moment. "That was close," he said. "Yes," she said. It was close. She knew how close because she'd been there, and the knowing of it was going to sit with her for a long time, in the particular way of things you don't fully experience until afterward, when your body has time to catch up with what happened. But right now, on the frozen ground with the smoke thinning and the herd noise settling into the distance, and Walt's hand still on her arm in a grip that was less about support now and more about the fact that he hadn't let go. She was too tired for anything except the immediate accounting. The ranch was standing. The herd had turned. The canyon was clear. Gideon was in the main house with a dislocated shoulder and cracked ribs, and nobody had gone back to tell him what had just happened, and he would be furious about that, she thought, and then she thought she would deal with that tomorrow. She put her hands on the cold ground and pushed herself back to her feet, and her knee made its complaint known, and she ignored it, and she looked at the 3 of them. Walt, with his permanent expression of contained assessment, Cal with his 17-year-old face showing everything he was trying not to show, Ned with his notebook probably still in his coat pocket out of pure habit, and she said, "Let's account for the herd." They went to account for the herd. The herd count took until nearly 4 in the morning. They lost 11 head to the gulch, animals that had gone over the bank in the chaos of the turn, in the dark, in the noise, and there was nothing to be done about that now except record it. Walt walked the gulch edge at first light and came back with a number and a face that said the number was as good as it was going to get, which meant it could have been worse, which was a cold comfort, but the only kind available. Mara wrote it in the ledger. 11 head. Current market value, recorded. Cause, recorded. Date and circumstances, recorded. She wrote it the same way she wrote everything, without editorializing, without the performance of grief that the moment maybe deserved, because the ledger was not the place for that, and she had learned young that the cleaner your records were, the less room there was for anyone to dispute them later. Later turned out to matter. Gideon found out what had happened the way injured men usually find out things, in pieces, from multiple sources, none of them as complete as he wanted. Cal told him about the stampede. Ned told him about the fires. Walt told him about the bridge, which was what put him on his feet at 5 in the morning with his arm in a sling and his ribs making themselves known at every breath, standing in the main room with an expression that was trying to be several things simultaneously and not succeeding cleanly at any of them. Mara was at the table with coffee she hadn't tasted yet, still in the coat she'd been wearing all night, her knee wrapped in a bandage that needed changing. She looked up when he came in and read his face and said, before he could choose which feeling to lead with, "Sit down." "The bridge," he started, "is gone. Yes, it worked." She pulled out the chair across from her. "Sit down, Gideon." He sat because his ribs gave him limited options, and because she'd used the tone she used when she was not making a request. He looked at her, the coat, the bandage, the smoke smell that was still in her hair, and something in his face changed. "How close?" he said. She knew what he was asking. "Close enough that I won't underestimate the eastern wind again," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I should have been out there. You were on the ground with a dislocated shoulder and cracked ribs." "I know what I was." The frustration in it was not at her. She understood that. It was the specific frustration of a man who'd built 11 years of self-sufficiency and had spent the last night of a crisis lying in a chair while other people handled it. That kind of frustration didn't have a clean resolution, and she wasn't going to offer him one. "The herd is mostly intact," she said instead. "The ranch is standing. Walt has men on the fire lines at first light." She picked up her coffee. "Those are the facts of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Were you scared?" The question caught her slightly off guard. Not because it was unwelcome, but because Gideon didn't ask questions like that. He was a man who processed things internally and expected others to do the same. The fact that he was asking now meant the night had done something to his usual reserve. "Yes," she said. "In the gulch, when the wind shifted. I was scared then." He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "Good," he said quietly. "People who aren't scared in situations like that are the ones who get killed." She looked at him. "That's exactly what my father used to say." "He sounds like he was a sensible man." "He was," she said. "He was also a bad farmer, but he was sensible." Something shifted in Gideon's face, not quite a smile, but the precondition for one. It was the first time, she thought, that either of them had said something that wasn't about the immediate crisis, and its ordinariness felt disproportionately significant in the exhausted 5 in the morning quiet of the room. The evidence came out of the burned camp 2 days later. Walt found the camp himself about a half-mile south of the Western Fire's origin point, tucked into a draw where the scrub would have hidden it from any casual inspection. It had been abandoned in a hurry, supplies left, a fire ring still warm when Walt's men found it, and in the rush of departure, a saddlebag left behind that contained 3 things: a hand-drawn map of the Holt property with the fire points marked, a list of dates, and a figure written next to each one that Walt didn't understand and Mara did immediately, and a letter. The letter was not signed, but it was written on paper that had a faint embossed mark at the top, the kind of mark a family put on their personal stationery, and Mara had seen that mark before, on a letter of inquiry she'd received 6 weeks after arriving at the ranch, a letter asking in politely menacing terms whether she'd considered the advantages of returning to wherever she'd come from. Raymond Whitmore's stationery. She sat with the 3 items on the table in the study for a long time before she sent for Harper, the solicitor. Harper drove out from Coldwater Flats the following afternoon. He was a methodical man, a quality Mara had come to appreciate precisely because it made him slow. He turned each document over multiple times, read the letter twice, looked at the map, looked at the numbers, and then sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. "The figures in the saddlebag," he said finally. "You said you recognized them." "They match the tally discrepancies I found in the ranch books," she said. "Someone was recording the stolen cattle head count alongside corresponding payment amounts. This," she indicated the list, "is effectively a payment ledger for the original theft from 2 years ago. And if we cross-reference it with the account books, it completes the chain," she said. "The original discrepancy shows the cattle were taken. This list shows they were sold. The map connects the operation to whoever organized the fires." She paused. "The letter connects the stationery to Whitmore." Harper looked at the letter. "Stationery is suggestive, not conclusive." "I know," she said, "but stationery plus the canceled contracts, plus the Voss water diversion, plus the noise trap that put Gideon on the ground the same night as the fires. That's a pattern. You don't need any single piece to be conclusive if the pattern is complete enough." Harper considered this. "The territorial judge assigned to this circuit is a man named Aldous Frey," he said, and stopped. "Aldous Frey, who is Ruth Callan's second cousin," Mara said. She'd been through the territorial directory. "Yes, I know. That complicates filing locally. So we file at the territorial capital." She had already written the letter. She slid it across the table to him. "I need you to review it before it goes. I want to make sure I haven't missed anything legally that would let them slow the process down." Harper read it. He made 3 small corrections and 1 larger structural suggestion, which she incorporated. He signed as the submitting solicitor, which meant his professional reputation was attached to it, and he did this without being asked to and without making a production of it, which told her something about where he'd landed on the question of which side of this situation he preferred to be on. The letter went to the territorial capital by the fastest post available the next morning. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Mara's time at the ranch, because they were quiet in the way of a situation that had crossed some invisible threshold and was now moving under its own momentum without requiring her to push it. The territorial authorities moved with the particular speed of an institution that had received a well-documented complaint with multiple supporting exhibits and no obvious procedural weaknesses. An investigator arrived in Harlan County in January, a spare man from the capital named Burkett, who asked questions with the methodical patience of someone who had been doing this for a long time and had no interest in hurrying. He interviewed Walt. He interviewed Cal and Ned. He interviewed Harper. He reviewed Mara's documents with the careful attention of someone who recognized organized evidence when he saw it. He also, at some point that Mara was not present for, had a conversation with Raymond Whitmore that lasted 3 hours and left Whitmore's solicitor filing emergency correspondence to 3 separate parties by the end of the same day. The ranch hands learned about the investigation in the way news traveled on the frontier, imperfectly, in pieces, with speculation filling in the gaps. What they understood was that the fires had been deliberate, that someone outside the ranch was responsible, and that the paper trail led somewhere specific. The effect of this understanding on the bunkhouse was something Mara noticed in the behavior of the men without ever seeing it directly. A shift in the daily temperature of the place, a reduction in the low-grade friction that had been present since her first week. Dale Pruitt was the last to shift, which she'd expected. He came to find her one morning in the second week of January while she was checking the south pasture progress and stood at the fence line for a moment before he spoke. "The fire," he said. "The night of the fires. Walt said you dropped the bridge from inside the gulch." "Near the gulch," she said. "I got up the bank before the eastern fire reached me." He looked out at the pasture. The grass was coming back in patches. Not uniformly, not pretty, but visibly recovering in the places where the rotation had worked. "I moved those stakes," he said. "In October, the south boundary stakes." "I know you did." I was wrong to, he said, plainly, without elaborate apology, which she appreciated more than elaborate apology would have been. You were, she said, equally plainly. The field is recovering the way it should now. He nodded once. That was the whole of it. He went back to his work, and she went back to hers, and the thing between them was not repaired exactly, but renegotiated, which was more durable. The formal findings of the territorial investigation arrived in February, and they were thorough enough to constitute the end of something. Raymond Whitmore was cited for conspiracy to commit property destruction and coordinating the theft operation traced through the saddlebag records. The citation was not a criminal conviction. The territorial system didn't move to criminal prosecution on that timeline, and Mara had never expected it to. But it was a formal finding with legal standing, and its practical effects were immediate and significant. 3 banks declined to extend Whitmore's operating credit pending the outcome of the formal proceedings. 2 of his business partners quietly renegotiated their arrangements with him. The Territorial Council, which included a man whose dry goods operation had been caught in the supply-cutting scheme as an unwitting participant, opened a separate inquiry into the coalition's activities. Hartley Voss settled the water diversion matter rather than contest it, which meant paying a fine and signing a permanent flow maintenance agreement that had more teeth in it than the 1871 document. The Aldridge family withdrew from active participation in the coalition with a speed that suggested they'd been looking for a clean exit for some time. The person who told Mara most of this was not Harper, and it was not Gideon. It was Eleanor Henderson, the same woman who had brought Mara to Coldwater Flats on the supply day that had changed everything, who came by the ranch on a cold Tuesday in February with a jar of preserved peaches and more current information than a territorial investigator. Frances Aldridge, Eleanor said, settling into the kitchen chair with the ease of a woman who felt entitled to chairs, is telling people she never agreed with the supply-cutting scheme and only heard about it after the fact. She set down her coffee cup, which is a lie, but it's a lie nobody can directly disprove, so she's going to get away with it. I know, Mara said. Doesn't that bother you? Mara considered this honestly. It bothers me the way things bother me when I can't do anything about them, she said, which means I file it and move on. Eleanor looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and respect. You know what people are saying in town now. Something different from what they were saying in September, I expect. Considerably. Eleanor picked up her coffee again. Clara Whitmore told someone that she never wanted to marry Gideon anyway, that she found the whole selection process undignified. A pause. 3 people told me this as though I'd believe it. Clara Whitmore is managing her own situation the way she knows how, Mara said. I don't blame her for it. Eleanor studied her. You don't have a mean bone in you about any of them, do you? I have plenty of mean bones, Mara said. I'm just selective about when I use them. Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, sudden and short. And it was the first time Mara had heard that specific sound in her kitchen, and she found she didn't mind it. The hardest conversation happened not with anyone in town or in the coalition, but in the main room of the ranch house on a Thursday night in late February, when the investigation was winding down and the immediate crisis had settled enough that there was space for things that the crisis had been filling. Gideon's shoulder had healed badly, not badly enough to be disabling, but enough that certain movements caused a catch in his expression that he controlled too quickly for anyone to comment on. He'd been back to full work for 3 weeks. He was quieter than before the fires, which she'd noticed without raising. That Thursday he came in from the evening check and sat down and said, without preamble, I owe you an accounting. She looked up from the ledger. For what? I chose you in Coldwater Flats because I saw what your mind did, he said. I was honest about that. But I also... He stopped, reorganizing something. I put you in the middle of this without telling you how bad it had gotten. The books, the coalition, all of it. I knew it was worse than I let on when I brought you here, and I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to refuse. She set down her pen. I know, she said. He looked at her. You knew? I figured it out in the first week, going through the books, she said. The pattern of it was too old and too consistent to be recent. Someone had been working against this ranch for longer than you presented it to me. She paused. I didn't raise it because I'd already decided to stay, and raising it felt like it would only make you feel you owed me an explanation, which would take time we didn't have." He was quiet for a long moment. "You decided to stay in the first week?" "In the first week," she confirmed. "Why?" She thought about it the same way she always thought about his direct questions, not performing consideration, actually doing it. "Because the ranch was fixable," she said, "and because—" She stopped for a second. "Because the problem in front of me was interesting, and I don't encounter problems that interest me very often." He looked at her. The firelight was doing something to the room, making it smaller and warmer than it was in daylight. And outside, the February wind was doing what February wind did in Harlan County. "I also stayed," she said, more quietly, "because I didn't want to go." She hadn't said anything like that before. She wasn't given to that kind of direct personal statement, and the words sat in the air between them with more weight than she'd intended. "I'm glad you didn't," he said. He said it simply, without decoration, the way he said things that mattered. It was not a declaration, it was something more accurate than a declaration. It was an acknowledgement of a fact that had become true somewhere along the way without either of them quite marking the moment. She picked up her pen and went back to the ledger, and he stayed at the table across from her, and the fire burned, and the accounts for the season were almost balanced. Outside, the south pasture was sleeping under the cold, gathering itself, the root system doing its quiet work beneath the frozen ground, building toward a spring that was still weeks away but was already, underneath everything, on its way. Spring came to the Holt Ranch the way it always came to that part of the frontier. Not gently, not in the gradual warming that people in softer climates described, but in a single week of violent thaw that turned the frozen ground to mud and the dry creek beds to rushing brown water, and made every fence line on the property need checking because the frost heave had worked at the posts all winter and now the evidence was visible. Mara was out checking the south pasture fence on the first real morning of that thaw, alone, because she'd woken before anyone else, and the habit of early rising was too old to break. The grass was coming up in the sections the rotation had protected. Not lush, not the kind of recovery that made for a good story, but real, measurable, the kind of green that meant the root system had held through the winter and was now doing what root systems do when given half a chance. She crouched down and pressed her fingers into the soil and felt the moisture in it, and something in her chest did a thing she didn't have a clean word for. She had been at this ranch for 7 months. She had arrived with a leather satchel and a small trunk and approximately no expectations beyond the practical. She had not arrived thinking about belonging because belonging had not historically been a category her life offered. You managed what was in front of you. You kept the books accurate and the ground productive and the problems addressed in order of urgency. That was what she knew how to do, and it had been enough. She stood up from the grass and looked at the pasture, at the fence line running straight along the south boundary, where Walt had replaced 3 posts in November after the frost showed him where the original work had been inadequate. At the water channel to the east that ran clean now, 12 months after she'd cleared the beaver dam with her own hands in an afternoon, because the problem was there, and she was there, and waiting seemed pointless. At the far edge of the property where the canyon sat, quiet and unchanged, not knowing or caring that 500 head of cattle had nearly gone over its edge in December. The ranch looked like itself. That was the only way she could describe it. It looked like what it was supposed to be, which was different from how it had looked in September. And the difference was not dramatic. It was incremental, accumulated, the result of 10,000 small decisions made correctly over 7 months by multiple people who had gradually, and not without friction, decided to pull in the same direction. She thought about Raymond Whitmore. The formal proceedings against him had moved through the territorial system with a grinding, impersonal thoroughness that was deeply unsatisfying in the way of real justice. Not cinematic, not proportionate feeling, not the kind of resolution that allowed for a clean exhale. He had not been imprisoned. He had been formally censured, fined substantially, and stripped of his seat on the Territorial Commerce Committee, which was the thing that had actually mattered to him, the thing that had organized his sense of himself. The fine he could absorb. The committee seat was gone, and the people who'd sat around that table with him were now sitting around it without him, and that was what it was. His daughter Clara had married a man from Redstone Crossing in February. Mara had heard this from Eleanor Henderson, who reported it without editorial comment, which was itself a form of editorial comment. Mara had thought about Clara briefly. The pale blue dress, the practiced smile, the particular kind of preparation that had gone into that morning in Coldwater Flats, and felt something that was not quite sympathy and not quite satisfaction, but was somewhere in the complicated territory between them. Clara had been positioned as a piece in her father's game without anyone asking her whether she wanted to be. That wasn't nothing, as a thing to carry. What Mara did not feel, she realized, was vindication. She'd expected to feel vindication when the findings came through. She'd thought the formal acknowledgement that she'd been right, that the ranch had been deliberately targeted, that the people who had laughed at her in Coldwater Flats had been laughing while actively trying to destroy what she was building. She'd thought that acknowledgement would produce a specific feeling, something clean and completed. It didn't. It produced a kind of tiredness that was almost peaceful, the tiredness of a long job finished rather than abandoned. She walked back to the main house through the mud of the yard, and the kitchen smelled of coffee, and Gideon was at the stove, which happened occasionally now. He cooked badly and without apology, and she had stopped commenting on it. "South fence?" he said. "3 more posts before summer," she said. "Not urgent." He handed her coffee. His shoulder had healed the rest of the way through February and March, the catch in his expression finally gone. He was not a demonstrative man, and he was not going to become one. She had understood this about him early enough that it had stopped being a thing she navigated around and simply become a feature of the landscape, like the canyon to the south. You knew it was there. You worked with it. What she had learned over 7 months was that Gideon showed what he thought through the particular quality of his attention. He listened to her differently than he listened to anyone else, with a fullness that wasn't deference, that didn't agree with everything, that would push back when he thought she was wrong. But that was complete in a way that she'd stopped taking for granted, because she understood how uncommon it was. He had been right about her, that morning in Coldwater Flats. She had been looking at the ranch, but he had also been looking at her in a way that no one else in that crowd had thought to, and she thought about that sometimes. "Cal asked about next season's rotation schedule," Gideon said. "I left it on the desk. He said he had questions about the East section. Tell him to come find me." She sat down with her coffee. "He knows enough now to ask the right questions, which is more useful than being told the answers." Gideon looked at her. "You've been teaching him." "I've been working next to him," she said. "It's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" She considered this. Cal Briggs was 18 now, a fact that had happened while she wasn't watching. He'd grown into the work over the winter in the way that young men sometimes grew into things when the conditions were right. Not suddenly, not with fanfare, but with a gradual solidification that you noticed one day when you looked at him directly. He asked better questions than Pruitt and worked with less ego than most men twice his age, and she'd taken to explaining her reasoning when she made decisions in the field, not pedagogically, just out loud, because she thought in words and he was nearby. "Maybe it's the same thing," she said. The letter from the Territorial Agricultural Office arrived in April. She almost didn't open it the day it came. It sat on the desk with 3 other pieces of correspondence, and she was in the middle of the spring cattle count and prioritized accordingly. It was Ned who pointed at it 2 days later with the mild persistence of a young man who had learned to read her enough to know when she was avoiding something without realizing it. "That one's from the Capitol," he said. "It's been sitting there." She opened it. The Territorial Agricultural Office was requesting permission to send 2 representatives to the Holt Ranch for the purpose of observing the grazing rotation methodology she had documented in her formal complaint filing. The complaint apparently had been read by someone in the Capitol with an interest beyond the legal specifics, because the rotation schedule she'd included as supporting evidence for the water diversion case had circulated internally and produced questions. She read the letter twice. Then she set it down. "What is it?" Ned said. He was not technically authorized to ask, but he'd been asking since December, and she'd never told him to stop. "They want to come see how we do the rotation," she said. Ned looked at her. "People from the Capitol?" "2 of them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the specific expression of a 19-year-old who was trying not to show that something had impressed him. "Huh." "Yes," she said. She wrote back and said they were welcome. Again, they came in May, Two men from the Territorial Agricultural Office named Pruitt and Garvey, who arrived in a good wagon and wore clean boots and carried notebooks, and who were so conspicuously earnest in their interest that Mara found it disarming. She had prepared to manage skepticism. She didn't know what to do with people who simply believed her before she'd explained anything. She took them through the south pasture first because the evidence was most visible there. The grass recovery was 4 months along, and it showed the sections under rotation were measurably denser than the sections that had been overworked, and the soil moisture at depth was holding better than the comparable areas that hadn't been managed the same way. She knew these things because she measured them, and she had the measurements in the ledger, and she showed Pruitt and Garvey the ledger, which produced a reaction she hadn't anticipated. "This documentation," Pruitt said, turning pages with the care of a man handling something that mattered to him. "You've been keeping this since you arrived?" "Since the first week," she said. "The water source restoration, the beaver dam. You documented this as well?" "Date, location, method, before and after flow estimates," she said. "It's in the October entries." Garvey was writing in his notebook. He'd been writing more or less continuously since they'd arrived in the south pasture. "Mrs. Holt, how did you develop this methodology? Was this from prior training or from necessity?" she said. "My father's homestead was failing. I worked out what wasn't working and why and tried to fix it. I got some of it right before he died, and the rest of it I finished here." "You had no formal agricultural education?" "No," she said. They looked at each other in the way of people sharing a thought they hadn't coordinated. Mara recognized the look and said, before they could frame the question politely, "Whatever you're thinking about saying next, say it plainly. I don't need it softened." Pruitt smiled. A real one, not performed. "We'd like to publish the rotation documentation," he said, "in the Territorial Agricultural Bulletin, with your notes and your methodology attributed to you." She looked at him. "There are ranches across 4 territories running the same overgrazing problem you walked into here," Garvey said. "Most of them don't know it yet. Some of them won't know it until they've already lost the season." He paused. "What you've documented here could prevent that." She stood in the south pasture with the May wind moving the new grass around her feet and thought about her father's 40 acres going brown in the dry years, thought about the way she'd worked out the rotation too late to save the homestead, but had carried the knowledge out of it like something rescued from a fire. Thought about arriving at this ranch in September with a mended dress and a ledger and not much else. Thought about 11 head of cattle in a canyon gulch, and a bridge coming down in the dark, and the eastern fire 40 feet behind her, and Walt's hand on her arm in the cold. "You can publish it," she said, "on the condition that you include the water source documentation as well. The beaver dam case is relevant to more operations than the grazing methodology." "Agreed," Pruitt said immediately, which told her they'd already discussed this possibility. "And I want to review the text before it goes out," she said. "I won't have the methodology described incorrectly." "Of course," he said. She turned and started walking them toward the east pasture, because there was more to show them, and the afternoon was moving. And behind her she heard Garvey say something quietly to Pruitt, and heard Pruitt respond with a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. And she didn't ask what they'd said. Walt Greer found her that evening at the south fence line, the same fence she'd checked that morning. A coincidence that was not a coincidence because she came back to the south pasture at the end of productive days the way some people came back to a window they liked. He leaned on the post beside her without announcing himself, which was his way, and they looked at the pasture together for a while in the easy silence that had taken about 4 months to develop between them. "The men from the Capitol," he said. "Word travels." "Cal told you." "Cal told Ned. Ned told Pruitt. Pruitt told me." A pause. "Pruitt is the one who seems most pleased about it, which I did not predict." She hadn't predicted it either. "People surprise you," she said. "Some of them," Walt said. "Not all of them." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the pasture still, at the grass she'd argued for in October, and he'd watched come back through the winter with the careful attention of a man who acknowledged evidence when it arrived. "What you did in December," he said. "The bridge." I've been in 30 years of cattle work. I've seen men make calls under pressure. He stopped. That was the best call I've ever seen anyone make, under those conditions, with what you had to work with. She didn't respond immediately. Walt was not a man who said things like that, which meant the saying of it cost him something, which meant it was exactly as true as it sounded. I was scared, she said. I know you were, he said. That's part of why it was the best call I've ever seen. They stood at the fence until the light went fully, and then they walked back to the yard in the dark, and the sounds of the ranch settled around them. The cattle in the field, the horses in the barn, the voices from the bunkhouse, all of it exactly as it should be, which was a thing she had learned not to take for granted because she understood now how much work lived inside that word, should. In June, a young rancher from the Sutton Valley came to the Holt property and asked to speak with her. He was 26, and he had a failing pasture and a water management problem, and he'd read a preliminary version of the bulletin that Pruitt had sent around before publication. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and a specific quality of desperation that she recognized because she'd seen it in mirrors years ago on her father's 40 acres. She took him through the south pasture. She showed him the ledger. She explained the rotation logic and the water source documentation method, and she answered his questions without softening the answers, because softened answers were how people ended up with pretty stories about problems that still needed solving. He stayed for 3 hours. When he left, he shook her hand, not as an afterthought, not in the reduced way of a man acknowledging a woman, but directly, with attention. Thank you, he said. Fix your south fence first, she said, before you start the rotation. The rest won't hold if the containment is wrong. He nodded and drove out, and she watched the wagon until it turned onto the main road, and then she went back inside. He was not the last. Through the summer, 3 more ranchers came, from 2 different territories, and each time Mara took them through the same process. The pasture, the ledger, the methodology explained plainly without performance. Gideon watched this happen and said nothing about it for a long time, and then one evening in July he said, You know what you're building. She looked up from the desk. I'm answering questions. You're building something, he said. Whether you call it that or not. She thought about this. She thought about the girl who had stood by a water trough in a mended gray dress while 47 wagons worth of Harlan County laughed at the idea of her. She thought about the laughter, not with bitterness, because bitterness required ongoing energy she'd never had to spare, but with the particular clarity of understanding what something had been and what it had cost and what it had ultimately failed to do. The laughter had been so certain of itself. That was the thing about contempt. It was always certain. It never asked whether it might be looking at something it didn't know how to read. She had spent her whole life being something people didn't know how to read. You saw it, she said, in Coldwater Flats, when nobody else did. I saw you looking at my inventory wagon, he said. That's not nothing, she said. Seeing someone look at something no one else thought to look at. She paused. That's the whole thing, actually. He was quiet, and the house was quiet around them, and outside the summer night was warm in a way that the December night had not been, and the south pasture was green in a way that the September pasture had not been, and the books on the desk in front of her were balanced in a way the books she'd found 7 months ago had not been. The canyon to the south was still there. The bridge was still gone. The 11 head of cattle were still in the gulch. You didn't get those 11 back. You didn't get to unchoose the things you'd chosen in the dark under pressure with the eastern fire 40 feet behind you. You lived with the math of it, what you saved versus what you lost. And you made the count as accurate as possible, and you moved forward with what the count gave you. That was not a philosophy she had read anywhere. It was not something anyone had taught her. It was what the years of her life had produced in her, the way the winter had produced the spring grass. Through cold and pressure and the particular patience of things that don't have the option of stopping. Gideon reached across the desk and set his hand on hers for a moment, briefly, without ceremony, and then he picked up the week's accounts and started reading, and she turned back to the ledger, and the lamp burned between them. She had come to Coldwater Flats in September to help with a delivery and earn $50. She had come in with nothing that anyone could see from the outside, and she had been laughed at for the nothingness of her. And the laughter had been so loud and so complete that it had seemed like a verdict. Here is what she had learned about verdicts. They are only as permanent as the people who refuse to accept them. She had never accepted it. Not in the yard with the 47 wagons, not in the bunkhouse standoffs with Pruitt, not in the dry goods store with Francis Aldridge's social machinery running against her, not in the gulch with the fire at her back. She had not accepted it because the thing being judged, the mind behind the gray dress, the mind that looked at inventory wagons while everyone else looked at the man, was not actually visible to the people doing the judging. They were judging the dress. They were judging what they could see from where they were standing. You cannot be diminished by a verdict on something the judges couldn't see. This was the thing she wanted the young rancher from Sutton Valley to understand, and the ones after him, and the ones after them. Not the rotation schedule. The rotation schedule was just mechanics, learnable, replicable. The thing underneath it, the willingness to look at a failing pasture and believe that it was fixable before you had proof that it was. The willingness to do the work before anyone acknowledged that the work was real. The willingness to be the only person in the room who could see what the room needed. That was not talent. That was a choice, made continuously, in the daily, unglamorous grind of a life that didn't always make sense from the outside. She had made that choice every morning since September, and she was going to make it every morning after this, on this ranch, in this kitchen, with this man who had looked at her that day and seen something worth seeing. The ledger was balanced, the pasture was green, the water ran clean. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of it.